When my mother-in-law told me to get out of her house as I collapsed in labor, calling me too dramatic for her 7 p.m. news, I knew everything had changed. I just smiled. With a single tap, I forwarded the entire living room security camera feed to my lawyer's emergency line. My husband started screaming at her, but neither of them knew I already had the baby's DNA results saved in a locked folder on my phone. You won't believe how that one file destroyed their entire legacy. The pain arrived without ceremony. It was not the gentle tightening I'd read about in the pregnancy books, the one stacked neatly on the nightstand in the guest room Margaret insisted on calling Tom's old room. This was a predator, a hot-jawed thing that seized my entire lower body, clenching with such vicious force that the world narrowed to a pinprick of light. I clutched my belly, the skin stretched taut and foreign over the life I was carrying. My breath hitched, a pathetic little gasp in the suffocating quiet of my mother-in-law's living room. The air here was always still, thick with the scent of dried lavender and the faint, acidic tang of disapproval. I was leaning against the doorframe, the cheap, hollow core would cool against my sweating forehead. "Margaret," I managed, the name a dry scrape in my throat. I think it's time." She didn't look up. Her focus was entirely on the newspaper spread across the polished mahogany of her coffee table, a silver pen poised over the crossword puzzle. The 7 p.m. news droned on from the television, a low murmur of distant disasters. Margaret's world was a fortress of routine, and I had just lobbed a grenade into the middle of it. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Sarah," she said, her voice the auditory equivalent of a thin, dismissive smile. "Don't be so dramatic. You're not due for another 2 weeks." Dramatic. The word hung in the air, a familiar ghost. It was her favorite adjective for me. My morning sickness in the first trimester had been dramatic. My concern over the budget for the new house was dramatic. My quiet tears after she'd called my chosen nursery theme tacky were the peak of melodrama. It was her scalpel, the tool she used to neatly excise my feelings, my opinions, my very presence, from any conversation. It rendered me invalid. Just then, my husband, Tom, walked in, a mug of tea in his hand. He saw my face, pale and sheened with sweat, and his own easy expression faltered. He looked from me, gripping the door frame as another wave began to build, to his mother, serene and unbothered. "Mom, maybe we should listen to her," he began, his voice taking on that familiar uncertain tremor it always did when caught in the crossfire between us. Margaret waved a hand, a gesture of such imperious finality it could have dismissed an army. "Nonsense," she sniffed, finally filling in a box on her puzzle with a flourish. "Hysteria, I imagine the word to be. She just wants attention. It's Braxton Hicks. Your cousin Valerie had them for a month." The comparison was another small twist of the knife. Valerie, the perfect niece. Valerie, who had 3 placid children and a home that was, in Margaret's words, always presentable. I, on the other hand, was the interloper. The career woman who had inexplicably charmed her son. The one who had opinions. The one who was currently leaking amniotic fluid onto her polished hardwood floors. A small, warm gush, undeniable and terrifying. "Margaret, my water just broke," I said, my voice flat with a sudden, cold calm. The pain was receding, leaving behind a humming, electric dread. Tom's eyes widened. He took a step toward me, but Margaret's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "On my floors? Sarah, honestly." She stood up then, her body rigid with indignation. Not concern. Not alarm. Annoyance. I had inconvenienced her. I had stained her wood. "We need to go to the hospital," I said, looking directly at Tom, trying to anchor him, to pull him out of the gravitational field of his mother's will. But the pull was too strong. He was a moon orbiting her planet, and I was just a passing meteor. "Mom, she's right," he said, but his voice was pleading, not demanding. Margaret's face hardened, the lines around her mouth deepening into grooves of contempt. "If you're going to cause a scene, Sarah, you can do it somewhere else," she said, her voice low and venomous. "I will not have this hysteria in my house." The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, disconnected from meaning. Cause a scene. Hysteria. Somewhere else. Then they coalesced into a single, brutal thought. She was kicking me out. She was kicking her pregnant, in-labor daughter-in-law out of the house. The cruelty of it was so profound, so utterly beyond the pale of normal human behavior, that it felt surreal. Another contraction seized me, and this time a cry tore from my throat. It was the sound that sealed my fate. "That's it. Out," she commanded, pointing a long, bony finger towards the front door. Humiliation and pain were a toxic cocktail in my veins. I looked at Tom, my husband, the man who had vowed to love and protect me, the father of the child fighting its way into the world. His face was a mask of conflict, his eyes darting between me and his mother. He was paralyzed. A lifetime of obedience had severed his spine. "Tom." My voice was a whisper. A final, desperate plea. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His gaze dropped to the floor, to the small, damp spot on the wood that had offended his mother so deeply. I'll call a cab for you," he stammered. "A cab. Not, I'll drive you. Not, let me get my keys. Not, to hell with you, mother. This is my wife and my child." A cab. A transaction. A dismissal. He was outsourcing his responsibility to a stranger. Something inside me broke then. Not with a shatter, but with a quiet, clean snap. The part of me that had tried for 3 long years to win Margaret's approval. The part that made excuses for Tom's weakness. The part that believed love could conquer this deep, gnarled dysfunction. It was gone. My hands trembled as I reached for my purse on the console table by the door. My hospital bag was upstairs, in Tom's old room, but I knew with a bone-deep certainty that I would not be allowed to retrieve it. I had my wallet and my phone. It would have to be enough. I stumbled towards the door, each step an exercise in agony. The baby was pressing down, a relentless, urgent pressure. I didn't look at either of them again. I couldn't. The click of the front door shutting behind me was the loneliest sound I had ever heard. It was definitive. An ending. The night air hit my face, cold and damp with a coming rain. It was a stark contrast to the fire ripping through my body. I was wearing slippers, thin cotton ones with little embroidered cats on them, a gift from my own mother. They were soaked through in an instant from the wet pavement. I made my way down the pristine brick walkway, past Margaret's award-winning roses, their dormant, thorny branches like skeletal fingers reaching for me in the gloom. I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, about the money. The $75,000 from the sale of my condo. My condo. The one I had loved, with its big sunny window and view of the park. I had sold it without a second thought when Tom proposed we move in with Margaret for a year, tops, after his father died. "It'll help her out financially, and we can save a fortune for a down payment," he'd said. It had made sense at the time. A sacrifice for our future. We'd opened a joint savings account, and the $75,000 had gone right in. Our nest egg. But Margaret had insisted on being a signatory on the account. "Just to help you kids stay on track," she'd chirped. "I'm good with budgets." Tom had thought it was a wonderful idea. Practical. Now, standing on the curb in the dark, I felt the chilling reality of that decision. My money, our money, was under her control. I fumbled with my phone, my fingers slick with sweat. I opened the rideshare app. Surge pricing, of course. Another contraction hit, and I bent double, bracing myself against a street lamp. The pain was a white-hot scream inside my head. I bit down on my lip, tasting blood. I would not make a sound. I would not give her the satisfaction of hearing me cry out. Through the pristine bay window, I could see their silhouettes moving in the warm, yellow light of the living room. Life going on as normal. The taxi arrived, an old, rattling sedan that smelled of stale cigarettes and pine tree air freshener. The driver, a kind-eyed man with a weary face, took one look at me and his expression shifted from impatience to alarm. "Ma'am? Are you okay?" "I'm in labor," I said, the words sounding absurd. "St. Jude's Hospital, please. As fast as you can." He helped me into the back seat, his hand gentle on my elbow. A simple, human kindness that felt so monumental it brought tears to my eyes. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window as we pulled away from the curb, watching the perfect, silent house recede into the darkness. No one came out. No one waved. Tom didn't even look out the window. In the back of the taxi, gripping the worn, cracked vinyl of the seat, a new fear began to bloom, colder and sharper than the contractions. What if this wasn't just labor? What if the intensity, the sheer violence of the pain, meant something was wrong? The books all talked about timing them, about the slow build. This was no slow build. This was a siege. The stress, the humiliation, being thrown out into the cold. What was it doing to my body? What was it doing to my baby? The fear was a cold, hard knot in my stomach, more potent than the relentless waves of pain. I was completely, terrifyingly alone, hurtling through a dark city, responsible for a life that was depending on me for a safe passage I suddenly felt utterly incapable of providing. The driver kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed with worry. "We're almost there, ma'am. Just hold on." I held on. I breathed through the pain. I focused on the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers as a light drizzle began to fall. I did not think about Tom. I did not think about Margaret. I thought about the tiny, helpless person inside me, and a fierce, protective instinct I'd never felt before began to burn away the shock, leaving something harder and more resilient in its place. Hours later, it was all a blur of sterile blue scrubs, beeping machines, and the encouraging, disembodied voices of nurses. I was under the unforgiving lights of the delivery room, exhausted to the marrow of my bones, but I had done it. I had brought my daughter into the world. They laid her on my chest, impossibly small and warm, her face wrinkled and cross, her tiny fists flailing. A fragile, flickering joy ignited in the hollowed-out space inside me. She was here. She was safe. The flicker was extinguished almost immediately. A team of nurses and a man in a white coat, a pediatrician, rushed in. Their faces were grim. They spoke in low, urgent tones, using words I didn't understand: tachycardia, desaturation, murmur. They surrounded her bassinet, which had been moved to the corner, transforming it from a cradle into a critical care unit. The joy curdled back into that familiar, cold dread. Just then, the door to the delivery room burst open. Tom. He looked frantic, his hair a mess, his eyes wide with a guilt that was hours too late. And trailing behind him, a smug, vindicated look on her face, was Margaret. She had her purse clutched in her hand, ready to dispense judgment. "See?" Margaret's voice sliced through the tense atmosphere. "A lot of fuss over nothing. I told you she was just being." Her voice died in her throat as she finally took in the scene. The swarm of medical personnel. The grim faces. The wires and tubes being attached to the tiny, fragile form of her grandchild. The lead doctor, a tall man with tired eyes and a serious expression, turned to face them. He looked at Tom, then his gaze settled on Margaret, who was now frozen by the door. "Your daughter is here," he said, his voice grave and devoid of pleasantries. "But she's in distress." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the sudden, absolute silence of the room. His eyes landed directly on a suddenly pale Margaret. "It's called Holt-Oram syndrome. It affects the heart and the upper limbs. And it's a condition that is almost exclusively passed down through the paternal grandmother's bloodline." The silence was a physical thing, a heavy blanket smothering the room. Margaret's face, a moment ago a mask of smug vindication, had crumpled. The color drained away, leaving behind a waxy, sallow canvas of shock. Her carefully constructed world, built on judgment and denial, had just been demolished by a single, devastating medical diagnosis. Her hand, the one clutching her purse, trembled violently. The purse, her symbol of authority, now seemed like a useless, heavy stone she was forced to carry. That's impossible," she whispered, the words barely audible. Her voice, usually a tool of command, was a dry, cracking thing. The doctor's gaze didn't waver. It was not accusatory, merely factual, which was somehow worse. "The genetic markers are quite specific, Mrs. Henderson. We've seen the characteristic thumb abnormalities on your granddaughter. We'll need to do a full cardiac workup, an echocardiogram, to determine the extent of the septal defect, but I am quite certain of the diagnosis." Tom finally broke his paralysis. He didn't look at his mother. He couldn't. It was as if a lifetime of looking to her for cues, for approval, for direction, had been severed in that one moment. He turned his back on her completely, a gesture more final than any shout, and rushed to Sarah's side. The gurney felt cold and hard beneath her, a stark contrast to the fire of fury and terror burning in her chest. "Sarah," Tom choked out, his voice thick with a grief that was years in the making. He reached for her hand, but she flinched, pulling it back. The sting of her rejection was a visible blow. "Don't," she said, her voice low and surprisingly steady. The exhaustion was a physical weight on her eyelids, but her eyes were clear, lucid, and filled with a cold, hard light he had never seen before. "Don't touch me. Not yet." She was looking past him, past the frantic nurses, at the tiny bassinet in the corner. Her daughter. Her tiny, perfect, broken daughter. The baby let out a soft, mewling cry, a sound that sliced through Sarah's heart. Every cell in her body screamed to go to her child, to hold her, to protect her. But she was tethered by 4 lines and the leaden weight of betrayal. "My baby," Sarah said, her voice cracking for the first time. Is she going to be okay?" The doctor stepped forward, his focus shifting entirely to Sarah, granting her the respect and attention Margaret had denied her for hours. "She is a fighter," he said, his tone softening. "But she's very sick. We're moving her to the neonatal intensive care unit immediately. The NICU. We have a team of cardiac specialists waiting. They'll do everything they can." NICU. The acronym hung in the air, another sterile, terrifying word in a day full of them. A team of nurses began to carefully wheel the bassinet, now a mobile life support system, towards the door. As they passed the frozen figure of Margaret, one of the nurses gave her a wide, almost fearful berth. Margaret Henderson was no longer the matriarch in charge. She was a contamination. A source. Her eyes followed the bassinet, wide and haunted. My brother," she stammered to the empty space in front of her. "He was always sickly. Weak heart," they said. Mother always said. She said it was a weakness we didn't speak of. No one was listening. Tom's world had shrunk to the space around Sarah's gurney. He stood a few feet away, hands clenched at his sides, respecting her wish for distance, but refusing to leave. "Sarah, I will fix this," he said, his voice raw. "I swear to you. I will spend the rest of my life making this right." Sarah finally turned her gaze from the closing door to her husband. "How, Tom?" she asked, her voice devoid of heat, just a chilling, honest question. "How will you fix a genetic condition? How will you fix the fact that you left me? You listened to her, and you left me to give birth alone while our daughter was dying." Each word was a precise, surgical cut. There was no defense. Tom flinched, his face crumbling. "I know. God, I know. I was a coward. I was a child. But I'm not anymore. I swear." The spell of Margaret Henderson had been broken, but the wreckage was all around them. The doctor cleared his throat, bringing them back to the grim present. "We need to get you to a recovery room, Miss Miller. You need to rest. Your husband can join you there once you're settled." He pointedly did not refer to her as Mrs. Henderson. As they wheeled Sarah out, she didn't look at Margaret. She didn't need to. In the sterile hallway, under the humming fluorescent lights, the real battle began. The next few hours were a blur of beige corridors, hushed conversations, and the pervasive smell of antiseptic. Sarah was settled in a private room, the kind of small mercy the hospital staff afforded to mothers whose babies were in the NICU. Tom had been a constant, silent presence. He brought her water, adjusted her pillows, and spoke in low, deferential tones to the nurses. He was trying, desperately, to prove his words with actions. He had called their landlord, leaving a frantic message about needing the keys to their new but not quite ready apartment immediately. He had called his work, explaining he was taking an indefinite leave of absence. He was building a new world for them, one frantic phone call at a time. When the cardiologist, a woman named Dr. Eris with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, finally came to see them, the fragile piece shattered. She held a tablet showing a grainy, black-and-white moving image. "This is your daughter's heart," Dr. Eris said, pointing to the screen. Sarah leaned forward, her stitches pulling, her body screaming in protest. She saw a pulsing, chaotic dance of gray shapes. This is the ventricular septal defect, or VSD. It's a hole between the lower chambers of her heart. Hers is quite large, which is why she's having so much trouble. Her heart is working 3 times as hard as it should be to pump blood to her lungs and her body. Can you fix it? Tom asked, his voice barely a whisper. We can, Dr. Eris confirmed. She'll need open heart surgery. But she's too small and too weak right now. We need to get her stronger, help her gain weight. We'll manage her with medication for now to control the fluid in her lungs and ease the strain on her heart. But the surgery is inevitable. Probably in the next 2 to 3 months. Open heart surgery. On a baby weighing less than 6 pounds. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. She reached out and Tom finally took her hand, his grip firm and steady. This time, she didn't pull away. She clung to him, a silent acknowledgement that they were in this together, whether she had forgiven him or not. We also confirmed the limb abnormalities, Dr. Eris continued gently. Her thumbs are what we call triphalangeal, meaning they have 3 joints instead of 2, like a finger. And the bones in her forearms are slightly underdeveloped. This is all classic Holdorum. It won't significantly impact her quality of life long-term with physical therapy. Our main concern, our only concern right now, is her heart. The specific physical evidence, the thumbs, the bones, made it so real, so undeniable. This wasn't some random tragedy. It was an inheritance. A poison passed down through the blood. Later that evening, they were finally allowed into the NICU. The room was dim, filled with the soft, rhythmic beeping of dozens of machines. It was a sacred, terrifying space. Their daughter, they had decided to name her Lily, was in a clear plastic box, an incubator that looked more like a science experiment than a crib. She was impossibly small, a nest of wires and tubes connected to her tiny chest and limbs. A ventilator breathed for her. Sarah pressed her hand against the plastic, tears finally streaming down her face. All the anger, all the betrayal, melted away, replaced by a wave of pure, primal love that was so fierce it was painful. This tiny creature, fighting for every breath, was hers. She's so beautiful, Sarah whispered. Tom stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders. She looks like you, he said softly. They stood like that for a long time, a silent vigil. The only sounds were the beeps and whirs of the machines keeping their daughter alive. In that sterile, technological womb, their family was being reforged. The old allegiances were gone, burned away by the crisis. It was just the 3 of them against the world. Their vigil was interrupted by a hesitant cough from the doorway. It was Margaret. She looked smaller, diminished. Her clothes were rumpled, her hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was out of place. She held a hospital cafeteria cup in a shaking hand. I wanted to see her, she said, her voice thin. Sarah stiffened. Tom stepped forward, physically blocking his mother's path. Not now, Mom. Thomas, please. She's my granddaughter. The word sounded foreign, uncertain on her lips. She's in critical condition because of a genetic flaw you knew about and never mentioned, Tom said, his voice dangerously quiet. You dismissed Sarah's pain, you threw her out of your house, and you left her to deal with this alone. You don't get to walk in here and play the concerned grandmother. Not now. Not ever. Margaret flinched as if he had struck her. I didn't know, she insisted, her voice rising with a note of desperate pleading. I didn't know it was this. My brother, David, he was just delicate. He had a bad heart. He died when he was 12. My parents, they buried him, and they buried the memory. It was a shame. A family weakness. We were never to speak of it. I never connected. I swear, I never knew it was something that could be passed down like this. The confession hung in the air, pathetic and horrifying. Her cruelty hadn't been random, it had been a deeply ingrained, pathological fear. Her dismissal of Sarah's drama was a desperate attempt to deny the very possibility that the family weakness could resurface. She hadn't been trying to hurt Sarah, not really. She had been trying to protect her own fragile reality, to keep the ghost of her dead brother from walking again. It didn't excuse it. It didn't forgive it. But it explained it. Sarah turned from the incubator, her face a mask of cold composure. "Get out," she said. "Sarah, please, I can help," Margaret said, taking a step forward. "This is going to be expensive. The surgery, the aftercare. You can't manage this on your own. Your apartment isn't even ready. You need me." It was the wrong thing to say. The offer of help, phrased as a statement of their inadequacy, was the old Margaret reasserting herself. "Need you?" Sarah's laugh was a brittle, sharp sound that made everyone in the hallway turn. "I needed you yesterday, Margaret. I needed a mother-in-law, a decent human being, to call a damn ambulance when I was in labor on your floor. Lily needed a grandmother who hadn't spent her entire life burying a secret that is now trying to kill her. We don't need your money. We don't need your house. We don't need your judgment. What we need is for you to leave." She looked at Tom, her eyes blazing. "Tell her to leave, Tom. Or I will." Tom looked at his mother, at the broken, desperate woman she had become. He saw the ghost of her brother David, the source of a lifetime of fear and control. He felt a flicker of pity, but it was extinguished by the fierce, protective love he felt for his wife and his daughter. "You heard her," he said, his voice flat and final. "Go home, Mom. We'll call you if we're ready." Margaret stood for a moment, the coffee cup trembling in her hand. The authority was gone. The power was gone. She was just a sad, old woman with a terrible secret. She turned without another word and walked away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Her footsteps echoed down the long, empty corridor, the sound of a final retreat. Tom turned back to Sarah. The air between them was still charged, but the enemy was no longer in the room. It was just them. "She was right about one thing," Tom said quietly, his face grim. "I called the insurance company. They'll cover a lot, but not all. The out-of-pocket for the surgery alone will be devastating. And the apartment, the landlord said there was a pipe burst. It'll be another month. We have nowhere to go when they discharge you." The reality of their situation crashed down on Sarah. Homeless. Broke. With a critically ill child who would soon need a terrifyingly expensive operation. For a moment, the sheer impossibility of it all threatened to swallow her. Margaret's offer, as toxic as it was, had been a lifeline. A lifeline they had just cut. She looked from Tom's worried face to the incubator, to the tiny, fragile life inside. A fierce, unyielding resolve solidified in her heart. They had survived Margaret. They had survived the birth. Lily was surviving a hole in her heart. They would survive this, too. "I don't care," Sarah said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I would rather live in a cardboard box than ever spend another night under her roof. We'll figure it out, Tom. You and me. We will find a way." She reached out and took his hand, her grip as strong and sure as his had been earlier. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the woman he had married, but the woman she had become, a warrior. "Okay," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, the first genuine smile in what felt like a lifetime. "Okay, Sarah. We will." Outside the thick glass of the NICU, the world was a mess of uncertainty and fear. But inside, beside their daughter's incubator, under the soft, rhythmic beeping of the machines that measured every beat of her struggling heart, they had finally, truly, become a family. They were broke, homeless, and terrified. But they were together. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The fragile bubble of their unity, forged in the sterile quiet of the NICU, lasted until 9:17 the next morning. It was punctured not by a shout or a disagreement, but by the soft, apologetic cough of a woman in a navy blue blazer holding a clipboard. Her name was Janice, and she was from the hospital's financial services department. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," she began, her voice a practiced blend of sympathy and efficiency. "I know this is an incredibly difficult time, and the last thing you want to think about is paperwork, but we do need to discuss the financial arrangements for Lily's ongoing care and eventual surgery." She laid out the figures on a small table in the family waiting area. The numbers were astronomical, a constellation of zeros that seemed to mock their empty bank accounts. The projected cost of the initial NICU stay, the battery of tests, the consultations with specialists, and the eventual open-heart surgery was enough to buy a house, the very thing they'd lost access to. Tom stared at the paper, his face slackening with a familiar, haunted look of helplessness that Sarah had come to dread. But the dread didn't take root in her. Not this time. She saw the look on his face and felt not a corresponding despair, but a surge of protective energy. "Thank you, Janice," she said, her voice steady. "We understand. We'll need some information on financial aid, charity care programs, anything the hospital offers." Janice brightened slightly. "Of course. We have an excellent social work team. I'll have someone come speak with you this afternoon. Her name is Evelyn." As Janice walked away, Tom slumped in his chair, running his hands through his hair. "A cardboard box, you said," he murmured, his voice thick with defeat. "Sarah, we can't even afford the cardboard." "Stop it," she said, not unkindly. She knelt in front of him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Look at me." That was the old Tom. The Tom who let his mother make him feel small. "We are not small. We are Lily's parents, and we are going to fight for her. We're going to talk to this Evelyn. We're going to fill out every form. We're going to call every charity. We will build a bridge to that surgery one single, tiny plank at a time if we have to. But we are not going to fall apart. Do you understand?" He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and slowly, he nodded. The warrior was still there. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and stood up. "Okay, one plank at a time." Evelyn was a godsend. She was a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes, a no-nonsense bun, and a binder that seemed to contain the answer to every impossible question. She met them in a private consultation room, offering them lukewarm coffee and a tangible sense of hope. She walked them through applications for state-sponsored medical assistance, explaining how Lily's critical diagnosis would likely fast-track their eligibility. She gave them pamphlets for foundations that provided grants for children with congenital heart defects. And for housing, she said, tapping a section of her binder. "The hospital has a partnership with a nearby facility, the St. Jude's Family House. It provides low-cost, long-term rooms for families of critically ill children. It's not the Ritz, but it's clean, it's safe, and it's 5 minutes from here. You'd have a private room and a communal kitchen. It would keep you close to Lily. Homeless to housed." It was a start. A real, tangible start. Gratitude washed over Sarah so intensely it made her dizzy. "There is one more thing," Evelyn said, her expression turning more clinical. "Dr. Chin mentioned it in his notes. The genetic component. He said the condition is passed through the paternal grandmother's line. Having a more detailed family medical history could be extremely beneficial for Lily's long-term prognosis and treatment plan. It might help them anticipate potential complications or associated issues." "Has your mother-in-law been forthcoming with that information?" The air in the room grew heavy again. Tom looked at the floor. "No," he said quietly. "She hasn't." "It's a secret," Sarah added, her voice flat. "One she's kept her whole life, apparently." Evelyn nodded, her gaze full of understanding. "Family dynamics," she sighed. "They're often the most complicated part of any medical crisis." "Well, the doctors will proceed with the information they have, but if you can get more, it would only help Lily." That night, after settling into their small, sparse room at the family house, the weight of Evelyn's words settled between them. The room was beige and anonymous, furnished with a simple bed, a dresser, and a small armchair. But it was theirs. A space free from judgment. They had spent the afternoon filling out forms until their hands ached, their first steps on the long bridge to Lily's surgery. Now, exhausted, they sat on the edge of the bed. "We have to go see her," Sarah said finally, breaking the silence. Tom flinched. "Sarah, no. We don't. We're done with her." "We said we were." "We're done with her control," Sarah corrected gently. "We're done with her cruelty. But we are not done with getting what Lily needs. This isn't about us anymore, Tom. It's not about our pride or our anger." Evelyn said the information could help the doctors. "If there's even a 1% chance that knowing something about Margaret's family history could make Lily's surgery safer or her recovery easier, then we have to ask." He was shaking his head. She'll never tell us. She'll just use it to get back in. To make demands. It'll be another transaction. Then we make it clear it's not one, Sarah insisted, her resolve hardening. This is the last piece of it, don't you see? The last battle. We don't go there asking for a handout. We don't go there to beg. We go there as Lily's parents, to demand the information that is our daughter's right. You and me. Together. You won't be standing there alone, caught in the middle. I'll be right beside you. And this time, we are the ones with the power. The truth is on our side. He looked at the woman before him, her face illuminated by the cheap bedside lamp. She was right. This wasn't about retreating from a fight, it was about finishing it on their own terms. It was the final, definitive act of severing the old, toxic ties and establishing the new, healthy ones. Okay, he said, his voice firm. Okay, Sarah. We'll go tomorrow. The walk up to Margaret's front door was the longest of Tom's life. Every step was a ghost of a past memory, running up these steps as a boy, shuffling up them as a teenager in trouble, carrying Sarah over the threshold with a heart full of false hope. The house looked the same, impeccably manicured lawn, gleaming windows, a wreath on the door that was perfectly centered. It was a house of order and control. Sarah rang the doorbell. She didn't knock. It was a small but significant choice. They were not supplicants. Margaret opened the door. She looked smaller than they remembered and older. The mask of smug superiority had been replaced by a brittle, defensive tension. Her eyes, usually sharp and critical, were shadowed with a mixture of fear and resentment. Thomas, she said, her voice tight. She barely glanced at Sarah. What are you doing here? I thought you'd made your choice. We're not here to discuss that, Mom, Tom said, his voice even. He felt Sarah's hand find his, her fingers lacing through his, a silent transfer of strength. We're here for Lily. How is she? Margaret asked, a flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, in her eyes. She's a fighter, Sarah answered before Tom could. Her voice was calm, devoid of the anger Margaret was so clearly expecting. It was the quiet authority in her tone that seemed to unnerve her mother-in-law the most. The doctors are doing everything they can. But they need more information. Margaret's jaw tightened. What kind of information? Your family's medical history, Sarah said, meeting her gaze directly. Specifically, regarding this heart condition. We know it comes from your side of the family. Hiding it doesn't make it go away. It only puts your granddaughter at greater risk. We need to know who had it. We need to know how it presented. We need to know everything you know. Now. The demand, so plain and unvarnished, hung in the air. Margaret recoiled as if struck. How dare you, she hissed, her voice regaining some of its old venom. You come to my home after everything and you make demands of me? Yes, Tom said, stepping forward slightly, a solid wall at Sarah's side. We do. This isn't about you, Mom. It's not about your pride or your secrets. It's about a baby in an incubator who is fighting for her life. Your granddaughter. Your flesh and blood. The secret is out. Now give us the history. Margaret's face began to crumble. The anger was a facade, a flimsy shield against a lifetime of fear. Her perfectly composed expression fractured, and her eyes filled with tears. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice breaking. You couldn't possibly understand. Then make us understand, Sarah said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. We're not here to judge you, Margaret. We're here for Lily. The dam broke. Margaret sagged against the doorframe, the fight draining out of her. My sister, she choked out, the words tasting like rust. I had a younger sister. Her name was Eleanor. She was born blue. The doctors in those days, they didn't know what it was. They called it a weak heart. My parents were so ashamed. They told everyone she had pneumonia. She died when she was 3 years old. We were told never to speak of her again. It was the family shame. The flaw in our bloodline. She looked up, her face a mess of tears and ancient grief. When the doctor said those words, paternal grandmother's bloodline, it was like her ghost walked into that room. I saw her. I saw my parents' faces. The shame. The terror. I panicked. I wanted it to not be real. I wanted you. She looked at Sarah, a raw and ugly truth in her eyes, to be the one who was flawed. Not my son. Not my family. It was monstrous. I know it was. Silence descended on the porch. The secret wasn't just about pride, it was about trauma. It was about a grief so profound and buried it had festered into cruelty. It didn't excuse her actions, but it explained them. Tom felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Not forgiveness, not yet. But a sliver of pity for the frightened little girl his mother had once been, forced to bury her own sister. "We need the names, Mom," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We need the records if you have them." "Anything." Margaret nodded, wiping her face with a trembling hand. "I have a box," she whispered. "In the attic. My mother's things. I think her journals are in there." She looked from Tom to Sarah, her gaze finally stripped of all artifice. "The money," she said, her voice barely audible. "For the operation. I'll pay for it. All of it. Please. Let me do that." It was the ultimate concession, the final tool of her control laid down as an offering. Sarah and Tom exchanged a look. They had already started the process on their own. They had the paperwork in their room at the family house. They had a path, their own path. But this was different. This wasn't a lifeline with strings attached. It was an act of penance. "We will accept it," Sarah said, making the decision for both of them. "But not for us. It will be a gift from a grandmother to her granddaughter. It will go into a trust for Lily. Nothing more." The terms were clear. It was help, not a leash. Margaret simply nodded, humbled. 3 months later, the world was a different color. The terrifying beeps and whirs of the NICU had been replaced by the soft gurgles and happy sighs of a healthy baby. Lily's surgery had been a success, aided by the detailed family history found in her great-grandmother's journals, which had given the surgeons a crucial roadmap. She was home. Home was a small, 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a walk-up building. The rent was reasonable, the rooms were filled with second-hand furniture, and the view was of the brick wall of the building next door. It was the most beautiful place Sarah had ever seen. The air smelled of baby powder and fresh paint. Tom was in the kitchen, humming as he warmed a bottle. He'd found a job with a local construction firm, working with his hands, building things. He came home tired and dusty and happier than Sarah had ever known him to be. The paralysis was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. Sarah sat on the floor of the nursery, a room painted a soft, sunny yellow. She watched Lily sleeping in her crib, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, perfect rhythm. No machine measured her heartbeats anymore. Just the profound, overwhelming love of her parents. The doorbell rang. It was Margaret. Her visits were infrequent and always prearranged. She brought no unsolicited advice, no judgment. She brought toys for Lily or a home-cooked meal for them. Today, she held a small, framed photograph. It was an old, faded picture of 2 little girls, one about 7, the other a toddler. I thought Lily should know about her great-aunt Eleanor," Margaret said softly, handing the frame to Sarah. Her eyes were clear. The ghost had been faced. "Thank you, Margaret," Sarah said, and for the first time, she meant it. Margaret stayed for an hour. She held her granddaughter, her touch gentle, almost reverent. She spoke to Tom about his work. She complimented the color of the nursery. When she left, there was no tension in her wake, only a quiet peace. The healing was slow, and the scars would always remain, but a new, fragile foundation was being laid. Later that evening, after Lily was fed and changed and sleeping soundly once more, Tom came and sat on the floor beside Sarah, wrapping his arms around her. They leaned against the crib, watching their daughter dream. The city hummed outside their window, a world of uncertainty and noise. But in here, in this small pocket of existence they had carved out for themselves, there was only stillness. They were not just survivors. They were architects of their own life. They were broke, but they were rich. They were in a tiny apartment, but they were home. They were a family, forged not in comfort, but in fire, and the bonds were stronger than steel. "We did it," Tom whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah closed her eyes, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. She reached for his hand, her grip as strong and sure as his. "Yes," she said. "We did."